It always amazes me how quickly peace can turn into chaos when the wrong people get a little bit of power. I bought my home in what I thought was a quiet, welcoming neighborhood, tucked away behind rows of oak trees and wide sidewalks. It was the kind of place where children rode their bikes freely, where dogs barked at passing cars, and where neighbors waved to each other while mowing their lawns. At least, that's what I thought I was buying into. What I didn't realize at the time was that this seemingly picture-perfect community was controlled by a homeowners association, and the people running it weren't concerned with community harmony at all. They were obsessed with control. This is my HOA revenge story, and let me tell you, it still gives me goosebumps when I think about how everything unfolded. At first, the HOA was little more than an annoyance. They sent welcome packets stuffed with rules, guidelines, and a list of fines that could be issued for violations. I remember flipping through the pages thinking, okay, sure, they don't want people painting their houses neon green or parking rusty RVs on the lawn. That seemed fair. But then I noticed the rules went far beyond common sense. Grass height could not exceed 3 inches. Mailboxes had to be painted one of 3 approved shades. Even holiday decorations had time limits. You could not put up Christmas lights more than 15 days before the holiday, and they had to come down within 7 days after. It was absurd, but I shrugged it off at first. Surely, I thought, nobody would actually enforce these ridiculous details. I was wrong. The president of the HOA was a man named Richard, though most of us just called him Rick the Ruler. He was in his late 50s. Tall, with a thick head of silver hair he slicked back like he thought he was still in his 20s. He wore polo shirts tucked into khakis, his HOA badge pinned proudly to his chest like it was a police shield. The way he strutted around at community meetings, you would think he ran the entire county, not just a neighborhood of a couple hundred homes. He thrived on issuing warnings and fines, and he always did it with a smug smile that made my stomach turn. His sidekick, Marlene, was the treasurer, a thin woman with sharp features and glasses that always sat low on her nose, peering down at everyone as if we were children. Together, they were the power duo of entitlement, and they had a little group of board members who nodded along to everything they said. The first time they came after me, it was for something as ridiculous as a flower bed. I had planted tulips along the edge of my lawn, and apparently the color of the mulch didn't match the approved palette. I came home one afternoon to find a bright orange violation notice taped to my front door. The paper fluttered in the breeze. The word violation printed in bold red letters across the top like I was some kind of criminal. The fine, $50, with a warning that further non-compliance could result in additional penalties. I was stunned. $50 for mulch color. I laughed it off at first, but that laughter quickly turned into frustration. When I confronted Rick about it, he smirked and said, "Rules are rules. If we let you slide, then everyone will want to break them. Next thing you know, this whole place looks like chaos." The condescension in his voice made my blood boil. I wanted to scream that it was just mulch, that nobody cared, that the only chaos here was the chaos he was creating. But I held my tongue, paid the fine, and changed the mulch. I told myself it was better not to make enemies. That was my mistake. Once they realized I wouldn't fight back, the harassment escalated. A week later, I got another violation, this time for leaving my trash can on the curb past 9 a.m. Never mind that the trash company didn't come until noon that day. Another $25 fine. Then came the warning about my mailbox flag being faded and non-compliant. $40 fine. It felt like they were circling me like vultures, just waiting for the next thing to swoop down on. And it wasn't just me. I started hearing from other neighbors who had their own horror stories. One family got fined $100 because their teenage son parked his car on the street overnight. Another was forced to remove a swing set from their backyard because it was an T approved. People were miserable, but most were too scared or exhausted to fight back. Every time I saw Rick's smug face at community meetings, talking down to us like we were unruly children who couldn't be trusted with our own homes, I felt the knot in my stomach grow tighter. His speeches were full of lines like, We must protect property values, and without structure, we'd fall into chaos. Meanwhile, his own lawn looked like a jungle half the time, but of course nobody dared fine him. Marlene would sit there, scribbling notes in her ledger, glaring at anyone who dared question them. It was power for the sake of power, and they thrived on it. The breaking point came one summer afternoon. I had just gotten home from work, hot and exhausted, when I found not one but 3 violation notices taped to my door. One for improperly stored garden hose, one for visible oil stain on driveway, and one for unauthorized ornament, which, get this, was a small wind chime hanging on my porch. 3 fines in one day, totaling $175. My hands shook as I read them, the words blurring through my anger. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the principle. They were trying to break me, to make me submit completely to their control. And in that moment, something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to take it anymore. I spent that night at my kitchen table with a stack of violation letters spread out in front of me like evidence in a courtroom. I read through the HOA bylaws cover to cover, every clause, every rule, every loophole, and what I discovered made me grin for the first time in months. The board was supposed to follow strict financial reporting rules, holding transparent meetings, allowing homeowners to vote on major decisions. But they hadn't been doing any of that. They were collecting fines left and right, but where was that money going? The bylaws required an annual audit, yet none had been shared in years. It was like pulling on a loose thread, and I realized the whole sweater might unravel if I tugged hard enough. I started talking to my neighbors, quietly at first. I knocked on doors, shared my own stack of violation notices, and asked if they had similar experiences. The floodgates opened. One neighbor, a retired teacher named Mrs. Wilson, broke down in tears telling me how she paid nearly $600 in fines over the past year for petty things like her blinds being the wrong shade of white. Another neighbor admitted he'd considered selling his house because the HOA made life unbearable. We were all suffering, but we were suffering in silence, exactly the way Rick and his board wanted it. That's when I realized, united, we had power. The plan came together slowly. I gathered evidence, copies of violation notices, records of fines paid, letters, even photos showing that board members themselves weren't following the same rules they enforced. I found a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes, and after reviewing the bylaws, he confirmed what I suspected. The board was operating illegally. They hadn't held elections properly, they hadn't disclosed financial records, and they had no authority to levy many of the fines they were issuing. That gave me everything I needed. The day of reckoning came at the next HOA meeting. Normally, only a handful of homeowners showed up, worn down by the endless lectures and power plays. But this time, the room was packed. Word had spread, and nearly the entire neighborhood was there. Rick stood at the front, looking smug as ever, ready to start his usual monologue. But before he could, I stood up and said, "Actually, I think we need to discuss something first." The room went quiet. All eyes turned to me. I laid it all out, every violation of the bylaws, every missing audit, every improper fine. I read quotes from the bylaws out loud, my voice steady, my hands shaking only slightly. I held up photos showing Rick's overgrown lawn, Marlene's unauthorized shed, the board's blatant hypocrisy. Gasps filled the room as neighbors realized just how deep the corruption ran. And then came the final blow. The lawyer who I had invited to the meeting stood up and explained that not only were many fines invalid, but the board itself could be dissolved and re-elected if a majority voted for it. Rick's face turned crimson. He stammered, trying to interrupt, but every time he opened his mouth another neighbor shouted him down. The power he'd clung to for years was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do. When the vote was called, it was nearly unanimous. The board was dissolved. New elections were scheduled, and none of the old guard were even nominated. The revenge was sweeter than I could have imagined. Seeing Rick's smug expression crumble into shock and rage was worth every ounce of effort. Marlene stormed out of the room, her face pale, her ledger clutched to her chest like a shield. By the end of the night, the HOA that had tormented us for so long was gone, replaced by a new board of reasonable, fair neighbors. In the weeks that followed, we uncovered even more. Thousands of dollars of fine money had been mismanaged, some of it used for board expenses that suspiciously looked like personal vacations and dinners. Rick tried to fight back legally, but without his position of power, he had nothing. He eventually moved away, unable to face the people he once lorded over. Marlene sold her house quietly, slipping out of the neighborhood without a word. Now, when I sit on my porch and listen to the wind chimes they once tried to ban, I can't help but smile. This HOA revenge story isn't just about me. It's about an entire community standing up to bullies who thought they could control us forever. We learned that rules only have power when people allow them to, and that sometimes the sweetest revenge is simply taking back the freedom that was always ours.